In our last video, we started talking about vertical asymptotes, and we said that to find the vertical asymptote, I need to find the zero in the denominator. And what we did was we took our denominator and we equaled it to 0 and found out what x is equal to. And then the next step was take this x and check it in the numerator to make sure that I don't get 0 in the numerator. So when I plug in 1 in the numerator, I get 1 squared minus 1 minus 2, and that gets you negative 2 in the numerator. So since I do not get a 0 in the numerator, this is my vertical asymptote. That means that when I start sketching my graph, I'm going to have in my x and y axis, at the 0, at 1, I'm going to have a vertical asymptote like that, like a wall. We also saw this example where I found my 0 in the denominator, and we said that when we find these x's, these are possible. These are possible vertical asymptotes. We can't say for sure they are. How do I know for sure if it is or not? Well, I have to plug in that value in the numerator. If I do not get a 0 in the numerator, then I can say for sure it is a vertical asymptote. But if I plug it in the numerator and get a 0 in the numerator, then I can't say for sure. I have to do further testing, okay? So let's check. X equal to 4. If I plug that in, that gives me a 0 in the numerator. So I can't say yet if this is a vertical asymptote. The other possibility is that it could be a hole. Okay, so it's possible that it's a hole in the graph. So let's talk about holes and vertical asymptotes. On this next slide, it tells us how do we know when we have a 0 in the numerator and in the denominator, then the graph can have a vertical asymptote or a hole. How do we know? It says we have to check the multiplicity of that 0 that is suspicious or possible vertical asymptote. So to do that, to see the multiplicity, we would need to factor. But let's look for our possible vertical asymptote first. Let's do that here off to the side. I have the denominator. That's what I work with when I'm looking for vertical asymptote. So my possible vertical asymptote is take the denominator, equal it to 0, and solve for x. So this is a possible vertical asymptote. Okay? What I do is I take this vertical asymptote, possible vertical asymptote, and I substitute this value of 2. I substitute it in the numerator. Let's do that. 2 squared minus 4 is 4 minus 4, which is 0. So I do get a 0 in the numerator, and I also get a 0 in the denominator when x is equal to 2. That tells me, be careful. Let's find out if it's a vertical asymptote or a hole. So for that, I need to check the multiplicity of that 0, of this 0, of x minus 2. To do that, I need to factor. So I take the numerator and I factor it. The denominator. So I've rewritten this function as in factored form. Notice I have x minus 2 in both the numerator and the denominator. Those are the factors that are making this function have a 0 in the numerator and the denominator. When I substitute x equal to 2, I get 0 in the denominator, and x equal to 2 here will give me a 0 for this factor, and 0 times anything makes the whole numerator 0. Okay, so now it says that if the multiplicity of the 0 in the numerator is greater than or equal to the multiplicity of the 0 in the denominator, then it's going to be a hole at that 0. Otherwise, it's a vertical asymptote. So let's check the multiplicity. Remember, this is the 0 that is suspicious here. So don't look at this 0, just the one that's suspicious. I have x minus 2 in the numerator and denominator. The multiplicity for this 0 is 1. And the multiplicity for this one is also 1. How do I know it's 1? Because it repeats itself only once. Okay? So the multiplicity in the numerator and the denominator is equal. And it says here that if it's greater than or equal, if the multiplicity of the 0 in the numerator is greater than or equal to the multiplicity of that same 0 in the denominator, then I'll have a whole at that 0. So I do not have a vertical asymptote here. I have a whole at x equal 2. Okay? Let's see our next example. In our next example, I want to find the vertical asymptote. So for that, what you do is you take your denominator, x cubed, you equal that to 0, and you get that x is equal to 0. Next step is, this is a possible vertical asymptote. You take that x, you plug it in the numerator. If you get a 0 in the numerator, then you have to stop and determine if I have a vertical asymptote for sure or a whole at that 0. So I plug in x equals 0, I get a 0 in the numerator. That means that I need to determine, what do? We look for the multiplicity in the numerator and the denominator. In this case, this 0 repeats itself twice in the numerator. And that same 0 repeats itself 3 times in the denominator. That means that the multiplicity in the numerator is 2, while the multiplicity in the denominator is 3. So the multiplicity in the denominator is greater than the multiplicity in the numerator. That means that I will have a vertical asymptote, not a whole, at x equal 0. Okay? Why don't I have a whole? Because I will only get a whole when the multiplicity in the numerator is greater than or equal to the multiplicity in the denominator. And that doesn't happen here. It's backwards. The multiplicity in the denominator is greater than the multiplicity in the numerator. Therefore, I know I have a vertical asymptote at x equals 0 and not a whole. Okay, on my next slide, in my next video, we're going to investigate this even further because I want to know exactly where my whole is. I know it's at x equal 2, but I want to know at what y coordinate is my whole. For now, I know that there is a whole at 2 somewhere in the graph, somewhere here. I need to find the y value that corresponds to that whole at 2. So for my next example, we're going to go over this again, the whole thing, plus if it's a whole, I need to find where that whole is exactly and precisely. Okay? Go back and, I don't know, rewind the video. The good thing about these videos is you can pause them when you don't understand. You can hit rewind. But make sure you go over it and that you understand what a whole is and how to determine if I really have a whole or not. Have fun with this. Make sure to practice. I'll see you in my next video.